I formerly worked for Ancestry. I now have my own consulting business where I work for different clients. I live just south of Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I have been researching for over 18 years. It's sort of my favorite thing to do. Today, we're going to be talking about researching your ancestors in the city. And before we get going on the topic, I really like to just say this important word, correlate. We are going to be really encouraging you if you haven't used a research log before, that you need to start using a spreadsheet or a table. I will show you an example as very briefly as part of what I show you today, citing your sources so you can easily return what you found and not repeat work. So not all research sources we talk about today are on Ancestry or on any one tree building site. So you're going to need to bring in information from lots of different sources from many different locations when you're researching in an urban environment. And those resources are not all online. So you're going to need to journal as a way to keep your work consistent. So my goal with this presentation is to make you aware of historical sources you might find in most major US cities and to encourage you to use all of them. So our aim in urban research is to correlate many sources into a cohesive view of our ancestor and the city that they lived in, as well as the neighborhood and community they inhabited. So a vast number of resources can be found to assist us as urban researchers, but we have to be very careful of the pitfall of same name people, especially in cities, because often there are 15 men with the same name. So you're going to need to often avoid going down the wrong path in your research by determining who among the many faces in the crowd is your ancestor. And sometimes that's going to require you to research all the people with the same name to then be able to methodically weed down to the right individual. So, as with all genealogy research, we want to gather all the correlating information and resolve conflicting information, and you're going to want to have a journal to deal with that. So, some of the resources we're talking today about in depth are going to be census records, city directories, deeds, maps, newspapers, city building permits, and land and survey plats. Though I will have a list of other items you want to go look for at the end of the presentation because we're going to have to blitz through this to get through everything. So this is an example of my journal format. I realize it's small, but what you want to take away from this is you want something to help you keep your citations. So I have that first column is my sources. I put all my citations in there, where I found it, what it was, and all the information I'm going to need. That middle column is purpose of search. Sometimes I use that, sometimes I don't. I frequently use it when I'm working with clients so I can tell them why I went looking for that or why I went looking for something and didn't find it, so that we don't repeat work when we have a negative search. Then I've got my findings and analysis column, and then I have a document number, again for clients, because I'll put a number in there when I find things, and that relates to the image files that I'm giving them at the end of my research. I always put in negative searches in here as well. This particular example, you'll see the 1875 state census in Scott County, Minnesota, where I live. That family, Joseph and Sarah Jane Boggs, are the first African American family to farm in this county. And they were here in 1875 with all of their children. And we can see that they came from Kentucky and Tennessee into Minnesota. That 1880 census that's in the journal, which might be hard for you to read, then shows that Sarah was a widow by 1880. And then she moved to St. Paul by 1882. So you see that little thing in there, Bugs, Sarah Jane. She's a laundress and living at East 4th. So in urban research, we're going to expand on all possible sources. It can be challenging for a variety of reasons, but it can also be a boon because so many records were created in a city as opposed to in rural areas. So some of the pros and cons I've listed here, I won't read them to you, you can read, are that in the urban centers, often vital records were created earlier than they were in other places. This is pretty typical, especially in big cities like New York City, etc. We're going to find records of people's births, deaths, and marriages much earlier than in other places. Now, some of the cons are that there's frequent migration. People move within the city a lot. Often people are renting, and ethnic and urban populations often have their names misspelled. So you have to be flexible and tenacious. So characteristics of cities Things to consider, right? Many families don't rent or own property, right? Many families move frequently from year to year depending on what neighborhood they're in. Neighbors are less likely to be relatives than in rural areas, and we have the same name person problem. Now, there's a little bit of a dichotomy between smaller cities and larger towns. There can be a challenge where you get fewer records, but often you can kind of lean into some of these additional records in smaller cities as opposed to big cities where we're going to talk about lots of different records today. So differentiating same name people, it's a really common problem in cities. We have to correlate all our information found. Because city directory entries vary from year to year, you need to use that research log or research journal to help you track all your gathered data. You'll likely glean some new data by following a person across location and time. Watch for changes for both spouses to a listing that changes to show a woman as a widow, or names her deceased husband. Watch for occupations and occupation changes. Often those pass down in families. So if somebody's a barber, maybe one of their kids is a barber too. So we'll discuss some examples as we go on later. Don't assume that people are not listed because they died or they left. Often people were unemployed and they might not appear in the directory, but they're still living at the same address. So my tip to you is make sure that you follow all the members of the family, because often you may be following from year to year between censuses one person only who shows up in the directory. And that same person is going to tell you when they moved, right? And sometimes the listing for the house and the listing for the shop that they own or the business is going, one thing will change and the other will stay the same. That keeps you knowing you're following the same person and not somebody with the same name. So also consider building a timeline that you can follow the family as they change locations. And we're also going to cross-reference with maps and deeds if they owned the property. So we're going to keep building all of that data so that we can bring it all together. City directories, where do I find them? Typically, you can find a lot of them on Ancestry and on Family Search, but not all of them are. MyHeritage has them as well. They've been around for a long time, back to the 1780s, 1770s, 1780s in New York City as well as Philadelphia. So a lot of major cities are going to have these, some more like the 1820s to 1830s. It depends on the city. Some publishers put deliberate errors in the directory to catch their competition from stealing the data as proof of theft. So be aware as you're tracking year to year, suddenly somebody disappears, the data might have been changed on purpose. So just be aware that sometimes that happens. Publications of directories over time can be costly. So often the producers of them would have advertisements to make up for the financial difference. So you might also find interesting advertisements for your ancestor shop or business as well. So don't be afraid to go looking through the whole directory. So you might start by accessing the most readily available things that are on Ancestry if you typically start your work on there. Ancestry does not have every city or every year of every city, but those things still exist. So don't assume that if it's not on Ancestry, it doesn't exist any longer. Go looking other places. And I'm going to talk to you about where you might look. So before we get to where to look, let's talk about what's in a city directory. So often there's residences. You're going to want to make sure that you check the front of the directory for additional parts to this directory than just the residences, right? So oftentimes these can be really useful because they'll list businesses, they'll be advertising. There is an errata and omission section frequently in these where people who meant to be in the directory and showed up too late and they'd already started typesetting the pages, they put them in that errata section. Additionally, you're going to find religious institutions, medical professionals, civil and military service, law, and postal offices, places your ancestor might go within the city to get information. So you're going to typically lock in on your family, find out where they were, and then start researching their neighborhood. What were the churches in the area? You're going to look in this front section for that. So also in the front of the directory, you're going to find frequently an index or a table of contents. And these are some of the things you might find there. So you're going to need to use the whole document, not just whatever Ancestry pulled up in the search. There can also be great additional content to find at the beginning of the directory. So dig around a little while you examine that directory as a whole document, and you're often going to find additional information about a neighborhood. Learn to interpret the abbreviations. Each directory is unique, so don't assume you know what an abbreviation means, or if you're confused, go to the front of the directory and find the abbreviation section. There's going to be a lot of variation depending on the publisher. Oftentimes, in cities in the South, the directories will be actually physically segregated. So there will be a section for the white families and a section for the people of color. So don't be afraid to look for that. Often in northern cities, you are going to see a C next to somebody's name or an abbreviation that says colored to help you identify people of color from people that are white. So oftentimes we want to go looking for that, but don't take that as gospel. Take it with a grain of salt because often racial designations were not anything that anybody went and said to the directory office, oh, I'm a person of color, put me down that way. It was something that was assumed when the directory folks came around to put you in the directory. So don't be afraid to just ignore that because oftentimes those are not correct. There are often some interesting abbreviations in directories, like there'll be a star to indicate someone's married. So go and check that abbreviation section so you know what you're looking for. All right, so here's my big tip of the day. City directories are extremely helpful to help us bridge the gap in a city between the federal censuses. If you're lucky, like in New York or Minnesota, we have censuses on the 5 years. So we have the federal census on the zeros, like 1900, and then there's like a 1905 Minnesota census. So frequently that helps us bridge those gaps between those 10-year spans. But city directories, if you're in a city looking for people, can be extremely helpful. So here's my hint to you. Start with the census. Where did your family live, say in 1900 or 1910? Those particular censuses are going to help you list an address frequently, especially if they're in a city. You're going to look for that housing number on the left. I'll show you an example later, and what address they were at or what cross streets they were living at. So then you're going to look for that in the directory corresponding to that year and see if you can find the family listed at that address. This technique will allow you to determine which John Smith is your John Smith and where they lived. But be careful because there are many people in the city that have the same name, right? So if the street address is not listed in the census, check the city directory for the family and then cross-confirm this with a ward number, usually at the top of the census, and then correlate that with a city map. What was that address? What ward number was it in? And see if you can get all of the 3 pieces of data from the census, the city directory, and the map to agree or not. So that will help you confirm if your family were in Ward 10 of New York City by looking at their street address in the city directory and then correlating that with a ward map. Words change over time, so make sure you check a resource that's near the year you're looking at. All right, so here's an example of this anchor technique. Our example person here is Henry Sullivan Mary. He is the first Black letter carrier in Duluth, Minnesota. And this is the 1920 census and the city directory. And you can see Henry S. Mary listed at 714. And I've pulled the street, which would be sideways down the side of the census, and put it up at the top. And you see they're at East 4th Street. So Henry S. Mary is a letter carrier for the post office, and his residence is for 714 East 4th. And his wife, Mary, is not listed in the city directory, but there are other people with the surname Mary. Are they related to him? Well, in this case, it turns out that Henry S. Mary is related to Henry R. Mary. That's Henry Raymond Mary, who's his half brother, who also works for the post office. Both of them were men of color, but they weren't listed that way in the directory. So don't assume that if there's no racial designation, that just seals the deal that they're not the same person. And in this case, Charles H. Mary and Cora M. Mary are not related at all, but I had to research them to know. So tips for the city directory search. Don't rely on the indexing for the search engine. Manually check each year. I'm going to show you how to do that. The indexing that was done on Ancestry was with an optical text reader, and the indexes have mistakes, complete pages that are omitted where it didn't read them at all. It got confused and perseverated and got stuck. So don't take the search engine as gospel. Use what it comes up with as a starting point and then start going out from all the years that don't show up, right? Follow that family every year and see where they moved, see what happened with them. Don't forget to cross-reference addresses found in vital records. So look for those duplicate surnames in the errors section, etc., right? Be flexible on your spelling. Notice at the top, we've got a highlighted section there for Minnesota, St. Paul, 1884, St. Paul, Minnesota City Directory. Those are the breadcrumbs that I'm talking about there. You can go up at the top and tap those with your cursor, and they're going to pull up a drop-down menu. So if you want to see the 1886 directory or 1885, you can tap that 1884 and it's going to pull it up, and then you can pull up the whole directory. Now you're going to then have to search manually through it to find the next entry, but use those breadcrumbs on the top. Also, don't be afraid to click the St. Paul, Minnesota City Directory part for what directory, because oftentimes there may be more than one directory for a city for a year. So sometimes there'll be a city directory and there'll be a business directory. So you want to check and see if both exist on Ancestry. Don't be afraid to go look other places because not all of them are there too. So my other tip for you is creative searching. You want to search for an address. I'm going to have an example of this later. You can use the city directory search engine page, right? And you can enter in the lived in location, in this case, St. Paul, Ramsey, Minnesota. And then in any event, I put a year. And then in the keywords, I put an address. So if it was indexed correctly, it will pull up all of those entries. Now, not all of them were indexed correctly, remember I said. So this is a good way to get you a few hits, and then you can expand out from there. I'll have an example of where I use this a little bit later. Okay, so next topic. We've talked about censuses, we've talked about city directories and how to put those two together. Now that you know a family is living at a particular address, whether they owned it or whether they rented it, hopefully they owned it, right? You're going to look at those building permits. Now, St. Paul and Minneapolis all have building permits cards preserved. Lots of cities do. There are also lot surveys and land plats that are often available for older city records. This is an example of a lot survey description right here. And you can see sometimes they have little maps, etc., attached to them. Lots of repositories have these archived. So you may need to go to your state or county historical society, genealogical society, city, county, or university library system. So in the case of St. Paul, those are at the Ramsey County Historical Society, which is the county where St. Paul is, or Hennepin County has the city building permits for Minneapolis. You're going to find them for other cities. If you go to Atlanta, I work in Atlanta a lot. You're going to find those at the Atlanta History Center. You have to go see them in person, though, because they don't have them online. But some cities do have them online. Often these were created and you can follow changes to a building over time. So if the roof was changed or they added on an addition, it's going to reflect on those city building permits because they had to apply for a permit to have the work done and approved by the city. So you're also going to hopefully, in those city building permits, it's going to reference a city lot survey or a land plat. So lot surveys and land plats for Minneapolis are at the Hennepin County Library. Woohoo! Yep. And the same ones for St. Paul are at the City of St. Paul's Surveyor's Office, but they have scanned them and you can get them online. And they have a variety of maps and plans, plat books, lots of aerial photos, all kinds of great stuff. And the Minnesota Digital Library at the Minnesota Historical Society has a lot of these too. Now, my examples are from Minnesota because I live here and I do a lot of work in this state, but every city that's a major city, almost all of these have been saved and archived somewhere. They're either in a library or a historical society, or they're still in the city office. So you want to go looking for those. Also consider looking for real estate listings, photos and blueprints for houses. You can get those at the city planning commission office if they've been saved frequently, if those buildings still exist. Okay, so your family's fortunate enough to own some land, right? And they own a property in the city. You're going to want to look for corresponding known land ownership and when they purchased that property, right? And you're going to find that in the deeds. And those deeds for a city are frequently held at the county level. So you want to go look for those. Often these deeds can prove or provide additional familial relationships that might be impossible to prove without the deed. So deeds can often provide a lot of vital details about property and connections to neighbors or whom owned a property and who was sold the property. Remember to check the real estate column 1870, 1880 census for hints about property ownership. And then 1900 to 1940, those censuses also asked people if they owned or rented in one column. So you're going to want to see if they have that O for owned, you might want to go look for that deed. Many deeds are available on Family Search frequently, but you might also need to go to your county or city archives to find historical deeds or consult the county deeds office. It depends on the location you're working in, where you need to go looking for it. Be tenacious, go start looking. The office where you might be able to find those historical deeds are not always at the county office anymore. Some older deed books, if they haven't already been scanned by Family Search, get moved to another repository like a historical society or a county or university library. So you want to go looking for those if you haven't found them within the county. I have also had to seek deeds at other locations which are not obvious. So if in doubt, I call the county library and the genealogy librarian there, or the local genealogical society might have a librarian, and sometimes those folks are a treasure trove of information on where the deed books or divorce files might end up being. So don't be afraid to go looking for them. I've found divorce records actually in deeds offices. Lots of these appear where they didn't start out. So here's an example. I think I told you a little bit about working in Atlanta. I do a lot of work for people who are descendants of the people who founded Cobb Bethel AME, African Methodist Episcopal Church in Fulton County, Georgia. And I was helping a client, and her ancestors are John and Ellen Oliver, and their sons are Charles and Thomas W. Oliver. And they were founding members of this church. I went looking for the land that I knew that John and Ellen owned in rural Fulton County, which was on the border of what is no longer existent Campbell County. And this family helped found this church. And so I was looking into the other people with the surname Oliver who were in the area, who lived nearby, who appeared in tax records and census records near these people. But, we had to prove that there was a familial connection, or we could just guess, because in families of the formerly enslaved, oftentimes we're looking at people who have the same surname who are not biologically related because they ended up taking the surname of their former enslaver. So that's a hurdle that African American families that white families don't have. So I was digging into this. We're working on probate files, and this file I found in Fulton County named John and his sons as heirs of their brother George Oliver. And this proved all of John's siblings. So they owned a property on West Hunter Street. I went looking in maps and in the newspaper to find out more about who were the heirs of George Oliver, John's brother. We'll have a little bit more on maps in a minute. Maps in a city exist for a long time. They've been around. There's lots of different styles. Probably the most useful ones for us are the Sanborn maps. And we're going to want to look in the front of the Sanborn map directories if they have them for your city. Try to find an era where it is closest to the time that the family lived in that particular address. Hopefully those still exist over time. You want to look in the index to find where that street address was. And then you're going to pay attention to those first numbers on that index to help you find what set of maps to look at. And then you also want to look at the key, because the key is going to tell you what type of buildings there were. So once you've found what part of the map, you can find your way to the address. Here's an example from Kenosha, Wisconsin. This is half of map 44. You can also see that map 47 and 34 and 35 and 43 branch off of that. So if you haven't picked the right one, you know where to go. So you can find your way through these maps. In this example, I have pink buildings are brick, right, based off that key, and blue is a hollow concrete. And so it gives you an idea of what the buildings were made of and what the roofs were made of. These were designed to tell insurance companies what the fire risk was for a building, but it gives you a good idea what the neighborhood looked like. So finding maps, you have to get creative. You got to go looking for different sources for these. Oftentimes, there's a whole bunch of links in your handout on where to go looking for these. Be aware of street name changes over time. So here's my first example of georeferencing. We got to hustle. I'm sorry, I'm going fast. This family came from Hungary. They moved to Massillon, Ohio from Ithaca, New York, where they married, and her husband died, and then she remarried. And there are two addresses, Ideal Court and the second house at Second Street. So while I was researching the family, I made this map for my client. The Second Street house is on the left, the Ideal Court's on the right. This was easy to find because there's still existent buildings in Google Maps. So this was not a hard one. Here's a slightly harder one. Benjamin Cobb was a former slave. He owned property in Atlanta. He owned a drayman's business here in this building. And when he was living there, it was 151 West Peters Street. And he also had a farm in rural Fulton County, and he's the Benjamin Cobb that Cobb Bethel Church is named after. So that's why I was researching him. He had his drayman business, which is a delivery service where they would have a dray, which is a wagon pulled by mules, and he would deliver things around the city. He worked with another young man named Kaja Cobb or Makaja, and he is also a former slave of the same enslaver and kind of got adopted by Benjamin. And they worked together at that business. Now, this address, 151 West Peter, doesn't exist anymore. So I had to correlate with modern maps and the older maps for this location, which is here in Atlanta. And we can still see that it's across from the train depot, but the train tracks have expanded into the neighborhood around in the area. You got to check newspapers, check for your ancestor's name, known family members. Again, we're correlating all of that city directory and city names in deeds, looking up real estate transactions or court notifications in newspapers. Go looking for these people. There's a picture of Henry Sullivan Mary from Duluth, who was our letter carrier. So don't just search for your family's name. Search your addresses, locations, business names, etc., to expand your search. Here's an example of using a city directory in combination with a newspaper. So George Buggs, way back at the beginning of the presentation, we were talking about the Buggs family and they came to St. Paul. Well, there's George Buggs and his mother, Sarah, and they were there in 1894. Now, George Buggs, there's a George Buggs who got in trouble in a craps game and got arrested. Is this the same George Buggs? It's not an address on Norris Street that I knew anything about, so I started researching what was on Norris Street. And in this case, their neighbor in 1894 was a man named Frank Grotz. And Frank Grotz was a musician. He came from Germany. And he lived at 199 Norris in 1895. So when George got arrested at the craps game in 1895, it was at Frank's address where he lived with his wife, Caroline Grotz. And you'll see they were an interracial couple. He was from Germany. She was born in Minnesota and was a Black woman. They started out being next door neighbors to George and Sarah Buggs and ended up moving the next year, but stayed in contact with their neighbor. Okay, so we've blitzed through a lot of information and resources. We've talked about census records, etc. You're going to want to look for all of these resources, correlate all that information in your journaling before you start writing about it. Don't be afraid to keep using that journal because it will help you from repeating negative search work that you've already done. Some additional resources you should look for that we don't have time to talk about today is looking for those addresses on vital records, looking at immigration and naturalization records, etc., church records, unique locations, so many things, occupations on records. So you're going to want to follow the family and anything you can find out about them in as many different ways as you can. So some of these are additional resources, and that picture is of all of the letter carriers in Duluth in 1915, and Henry Sullivan Mary's up in the upper left corner. We've made it through with just 3 minutes to spare for questions, but I'm willing to hang around for longer. So let me unshare my screen and we can get to that.
We do have a few questions for you. So the first one says, when I am looking at a particular person on a census page, I often look at 5 pages before and 5 after. Sometimes The page has run out. How do I find out the page of the next county or street that the census taker started with?
That is difficult depending on how they laid out their mapping. Um, there isn't a real rhyme or reason. Sometimes they would go across the street and around the block and then jig jog around. So frequently, you're not going to know for sure what their path was. You just are going to follow what's there and keep looking, right? So it is a great rule of thumb to go at least 5 pages forward and back. You never know what you're going to find. Um, so I don't have a really good answer for you. Sorry.
So, someone is asking, how would you begin a search for union records? My grandpa was a union member in Seattle from around 1920. His death was in 1965.
So start first at your historical society and see if they have anything on record. Also, go see if the union still exists. And they might have records. And if they don't have the records anymore, they may know where it went to be archived. Hopefully, it was archived and didn't disappear. Because you do want to check those occupational records. That's a great resource for information. Also, looking into um, like Masonic affiliations or Oddfellows memberships. That was a really common thing. Or relief societies for particular ethnic groups and or religious groups. So sometimes those records are still housed where they originally started, and sometimes they've migrated to genealogical societies, libraries, historical societies, universities, and sometimes they're not even where they started out being, right? They've moved to a completely different part of the country or a completely different city. So don't be afraid to look on WorldCat for things. Public Library of America is a great place to look. Sometimes for those things, you can figure out where things have gone into the universe. So,
Thank you. Our next one is, do you have any tips on deciphering legal language within deeds?
yes, the Legal Genealogist webpage is wonderful. That's a great place to go looking for information on that. Um, I'm trying to remember her name. It'll come to me. But yes, that
Judy Russell.
Judy Russell. Thank you. Yes. Yes, she's fabulous. She will have a lot of information. If you don't find it there, there is another person I'm thinking of, Michael Ramage, Ramage. He also has excellent information for genealogists doing stuff in legal documents. They're both lawyers. So,
Thank you. And it looks like we have one more question. So I'll stick our email in the chat. So if anybody has any more questions later that come up, or if you'd like a copy of the chat from today's program, send us an email at genealogy@acpl.info and we can get that to you. So for our last question, are there any particular strategies that you use when an ancestor's name produces maybe too many results in something like a newspaper search?
okay. So if you're getting too much information, you may be finding same name people. So then you want to really pay attention to where are they in the city, if there's a reference in whatever you found in a newspaper to an address, track everything you find in that journal, and you may end up parsing out this is the John Smith down the block, this is the John Smith on the other side of the city. And Kari Taplin has a really great blog, Genealogy Pants, where she has parsed out like 5 or 6 men of the same name in the same county or surrounding counties, where she talks through a lot of tips about how to do that. So pay attention to occupations of people and who else might be at an address to help you sort of narrow in on, is this my John Smith or not? Yeah.
Thank you. And I lied. We did have one more that came in, if you don't mind.
No, I don't mind.
Um, and is asking if you have any tips on finding photos for African American families. My searches yield no photos, so they're looking for some clues for that.
It's challenging. It helps to sometimes follow descendants of that family member and contact living descendants. If you don't know them, you might be able to research forward in time and see if you can find out who they are and maybe see if they have photos. Oftentimes, families are poor, whether they're African American or not, and none of them have photos before a certain period of time. Oftentimes, it was a little bit more affordable in rural areas to go to the town because there was a photo studio set up. Frequently, you're going to find more people being able to access that in a city. It is challenging to find those. I have found photos of African Americans sometimes in the strangest places at universities, depend like those pictures of Henry Sullivan Mary. One was from the newspaper, but I have a really great close-up of him that was taken by, I think, the local postal workers union, and those ended up at the University of Minnesota Duluth. And he was identified by name, but he's not identified by name in the mass picture of all the postal carriers, but we know it's him because he was the only postal carrier at that time. So, and his brother came along later to come and work with him. So, frequently they end up in places you don't always go looking. So if you know a family's in a particular area, check the university library and see if they have any pictures. Um, just be tenacious, look in places you wouldn't think. And sometimes a Google search will find you the strangest, coolest things. So good luck. I know African American families are challenging. That's one of the things I specialize here in Minnesota because none of my family are Minnesotans, even though I live here. I That is the one thing I do in the state. I'm part of a consortium group, and we do we're called the Early Midwest Black Heritage Group, and it's a collection of local historians, local genealogists, and we're all trying to trace all the early Black pioneers in our state. So, yeah, it can be challenging. Just keep at it, and hopefully you'll find something.
That's great. Thank you so much. And again, our email for anyone who would like a copy of the chat or if you have other questions is genealogy@acpl.info. So thank you to everybody for attending, and thank you very much, Jessica, for presenting. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thanks for blitzing through
Thanks.
so much with me.
Have a good day.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.